welcome back to Dukascopy TV. Joining me in the studio now is Elias Ashkar of Futura21. Elias, thank you very much for coming back in.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a pleasure.
Now, today we're going to be discussing Syria. Not the most cheerful of topics, but a very, very, very important one at present. Why is the Syria issue taking such a global dimension? We've got sort of divisions between permanent members of the UN Security Council, a lot of debate and division and discussion within the UN organization itself. Why is this?
You're absolutely right, actually. It seems as if the Syria issue became almost bigger than Syria itself, with all these global players getting involved. On the one hand, you have China, Russia, and Iran. On the other hand, you have the United States, you have the European Union, you have Turkey, and you have the Gulf states. Everybody's getting involved. But initially, it didn't start that way. It was a very simple process of people, regular civilians, marching in the streets, asking for their rights, the rights that you and I take for granted: freedom, democracy, liberty, human rights, and so on. But then that regime, the Assad regime that's been going on in Syria for about 40 years, dealt with that in a very brutal way. That created a little bit of tension in the region, where the regional players started getting involved, like Iran on the one hand, the Arab countries on the other hand, together with Turkey. And from there, of course, it developed there, whereby you have now Russia, China, Iran on one hand supporting the Assad regime. On the other hand, you have the United States, the EU, the Gulf countries, and Turkey supporting the rebels. The unfortunate thing is, these guys have very opposing agendas, very opposing views. The gap between them is very, very wide, could not be bridged during 2.5 years. As a matter of fact, what complicated the situation more, the same guys who are heavily involved in Syria, it so happened they are the 5 members, permanent members of the United Nations. That complicated the task of the United Nations, whereby it even made the United Nations over 2.5 years not being able to deal with actually the world's worst atrocities nowadays. I understand that last night the 5 permanent members of the Security Council agreed on a resolution for the chemical weapons. But the chemical weapons is not really what killed over 110,000 people, displaced millions of people. You have millions of Syrians, refugees living in terrible conditions in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. It's a tragedy, and it's a shame on such an organization not to be able to put what is in the best interest of the Syrian people first, rather than what's in the best interest of these countries who are fighting it out there.
But the media line that we keep being fed from world leaders, from politicians involved in these discussions, is that the situation in Syria is very different to situations that we've seen previously with regards to the Arab Spring in 2010, with regards to other unrest that we've seen previously this year. What makes Syria so different?
Indeed, it is very different. If we look back, for example, what happened in Egypt. Egypt is the most populated country in the Middle East, a very big country, and what happened in Tunisia. These people also, they wanted their liberty and freedom and democracy and so on. And they were able to eject these dictators like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Ben Ali in Tunisia. It was only a matter of weeks. And we didn't hear of all these different countries getting involved in arming the different rebels and so on. But it's not the same in Syria. In Syria, it's been going on for 2.5 years, thousands of people killed, millions of people displaced. There are many, many reasons why they are different, Syria versus the others. We don't have time to go through a list of how different it is, but I would just focus on 2 key areas. One is religion. Unfortunately, the situation in Syria awakened a long time, centuries-old tension within the Muslim community between Sunnis and Shia. And because Iran is Shia country, got involved in this. For the last over 30 years or so, the Syrian regime aligned itself, instead of with the Arabs, majority Sunnis, aligned itself with Iran, Shia. So this is what's contributing today, for example, for all these jihadists and extremists. So it became, unfortunately, almost like a Sunni Shia thing. That's the religious part. The economic and political part, Iran for centuries, their dream was, as the Persian Empire, to have access to the Mediterranean. And through Syria, they have access to the Mediterranean. In addition to major economic ties, they have lots of activities, economic activities between the two. If you look at Russia, also, Russia on two fronts. Politically, if Russia does not support Iran and Syria, they have no influence in that part of the world. That was not the case in Egypt, for example, because they have no influence in Egypt or in Tunisia, Iran or Russia. So this kind of situation made it with Iran and Russia being so heavily involved with a major stake politically and economically. I think between Iran and Syria, for Russia, they're probably their biggest customers in terms of buying arms and so on. So that makes, Syria slightly more difficult and different than the rest.
We've got talks that are taking place in Geneva in the near future, and they're intended to tackle the Syria crisis. What, for you, do you think is likely to be the outcome from these talks?
Well, if we want to talk about the future, let's learn from the past. Now we're talking about Geneva 2, but already Geneva 1 took place about a year ago. Even Geneva 1, lots of talks, discussions, optimism, and everything else. What's the end result? The Syria problem, crisis still going on. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Unfortunately, if I were to project what happened in the past, the Geneva 1 to Geneva 2 may be even more complicated. Because when you want to put people around the table to discuss, a solution to the problem, you need to have two parties who are willing to sit around the table and talk. So I'm not so sure Russia or the United States are going to be able to bring all these people around the table to have a discussion. Especially what complicated the issue even more, you have the rebels now that are fragmented into different groups, and they're almost infighting between themselves. So it's making it very, very difficult. Now, I don't want to be negative or pessimistic here, but I would say I'm hoping now that the Security Council, the 5 members of the Security Council, they seem to start making a little bit of a progress like what they did last night on the chemical weapons. Maybe that will help towards bringing an end to this. Am I very optimistic? I say, I hope so. I'm a little bit skeptical. We'll see what happens.
Elias, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts on this matter.
Thank you, as always. Thank you very much.
That's all we've got time for right now, but don't go away. We'll be back shortly with plenty more exclusive interviews. Goodbye for now.